Last week I spoke about certain very important topics, ideas. But what I thought I would do this week is just, in a certain sense, is to give you a broad picture of what the whole process is in terms of what God wants. And from that you can begin to see the timetable of each idea. I had mentioned certain ideas, I think, but a long time ago, maybe a year and a half ago. But I thought it'd be good to again to speak about actually it's the tikkun process, and within that there's a messianic process to give you much broader insight into the timetables of what goes on and so on, And in that, to speak about just a couple of events which I thought were very pivotal in terms of moving the process forward. I had mentioned many times that the divine agenda is really, to us, it's really sort of like a chess game. I had mentioned that I once read that a professional or a world-class chess player, how many moves can he see ahead? For instance, if you move a pawn, or let's say something more significant, a knight or whatever, and so on. How many moves can he calculate, figure ahead of what the possibilities of that move is? So I once read somewhere that he could figure out, we could maybe see one or two, that's about it. But these guys, I once read, can see 15 moves ahead. You have to understand what the combinations and permutations are of that one move. It's astounding. But these guys lig, as they say, they lie in this. They look at boards and they memorize all kinds of possibilities. So obviously they can see much further ahead. But even they are limited to, let's say, 15 moves ahead. The interesting thing about God, the Rabbi Shalom, is that he will move one pawn, let's say it's an event, you see. So we don't even understand what the event signifies. Certainly, that's number one. We don't even understand the full repercussions of that event, let alone understand how this move is now connected to the next move, which is connected to the next move. We don't see the connections between the moves. So obviously we can't really, we do not really see, based on that type of scenario, where everything is leading. But what God can do is something which you can't do in a chess game. He can move one piece, 800 years ago, and the next piece he can move, 700 years ago, and so on. So how can we possibly connect? We don't even live that long to see the connections. But really what goes on is that what's important to know is that nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, happens by accident. Everything is planned, whether we see it or not. Obviously, most of the time we don't see it. But so everything is planned because everything is headed in a certain direction. Everything advances the purpose of creation. Every event. And obviously, like I said, we don't necessarily see that event, and we certainly don't see its connection to other events. So therefore, what's important is to understand what's called a game plan. At least in chess, we know the game really is, in the end, is to get the king. Chess is an Arab game, and if you know that, it was discovered in Arabia. And that's why when you say checkmate, it's really sheikh mate. If I want to use that word, a sheikh we know is an Arab king or whatever, or chieftain or leader, whatever, So when you say checkmate, you're really saying sheikh mate, and so on, I once read that I think the one who discovered chess was some guy named, if I'm historically correct, some guy named Sisi Ben Dahir. I may be wrong, but this is what I remember, So whoever the caliph was wanted to reward him for inventing chess. So so he said, what would you like? Here's what I would like. Okay, I want 1 grain of wheat, just one, on the first, because there was a whole bunch of 64 squares. So the first grain on the first box. Then on the second box, you'll give me 2 grains. On the third box, you'll give me 4. And then 8, 16, 32, 64, right? And so 128. In other words, what you do is you multiply, you square it. I think that's really what you're doing, You're doubling it, whatever, So the king said that's quite modest. It was a big deal, You start out with 1 grain, So he said, fine. And he began to do it. 1, 2, 4, and so on, right? By the time he got to half the board, he put down 1 sack of wheat. It was now a whole sack, you see. And he realized, I'm only finished with half the board. I got to double that to 2 sacks and so on, So the calculation is that by the time you get to the 64th square, he would have the world's wheat production for the next 2,000 years. No, so history, I don't know, history records what he did to the guy. It was easier to declare checkmate and just lop his head off. But anyway, so therefore, but at least in chess we know what happens. So therefore, it's very advantageous, obviously, to see the game plan, as they say, of the whole board, and where's all this headed, you see. So that already gives you an advantage. If you know where it's headed, and you have a certain time framework and so on, that gives you an edge in terms of trying to understand different events. So I thought that would be really very interesting. We know the whole concept. Ultimately, the whole purpose of creation is what is called tikkun. Tikkun means rectification, we know, or restoration, right? Of the bria, of creation. What that essentially means is that God conceals himself, and he wants mankind initially to bring him back. And the way you bring him back is by doing his will. That's basically what the whole process is really all about. In other words, he wants mankind, initially that's what he wanted, to fix the existential state of the universe or of creation. So in the beginning, God is absent from creation, not literally, but figuratively. And then the whole point, of course, is to bring him back, and so on. And this, of course, is called tikkun. And there have been different attempts to do the tikkun. And it could have been done basically at really, when you think about it, at 3 points in history. You see, it could be done really any time, because the Jews can do the tikkun in one shot if everybody did tshuva, basically. But if tshuva is not happening, then the tikkun basically moves forward, and it could have come at 3 points in history. First point is the first stage of man is called Adam, man. And he was, of course, created on the 6th day. And he had to do the entire process of tikkun really in 1 day. Had he done that, then Shabbos would have come, the 7th day, and actually he would have been Mashiach. And that would be the end of the entire world. We would have been born, we would still have been born, but in what's called a rectified state. In any case, Adam, of course, failed. Of course, his task was to do what? Was to not to eat from the tree of good and evil, whatever, and he failed. So that was really the first attempt by a man, okay, not a Jew, but by a man, to do the tikkun, and he failed. So that is many ways the first attempt. The next attempt, of course, was given now to mankind in general. And what God wanted is mankind, not Jews, but mankind. There were no Jews, actually. First Jew is Avram Avinu. But what he wanted is mankind also to do the tikkun. And they could have done the tikkun. And God gave them 2,000 years. But of course, we know they failed. In the first 10 generations, they failed. And that was the generation of Noach, where, of course, Noach, the whole world was flooded with a flood. And of course, they obviously failed. Then They had a second attempt after Noach until Avram Avinu, which is another 10 generations, and they again failed. So in a certain sense, that was the stage called mankind doing the tikkun. So the first stage is Adam doing the tikkun, and the second stage is mankind doing the tikkun. They failed. So then there was another arrangement, okay, where the Rebbe Shem gave the task of tikkun to bring God back by doing His will. He gave it to Avram Avinu. And Avram Avinu was 52 years old when the world turned 2000. So 2,000 years had passed, and Avram Avinu now picked up the slack, so to speak, to do it. And of course, it was not just Avram Avinu, but it was he and his descendants. So that's another stage of trying to do the tikkun. Everything, of course, ultimately culminated in Egypt, Mitzrayim. I'm obviously leaving out a lot of material. And when they finished, when they left Egypt, they had done the tikkun. They had almost, the tikkun was accomplished 99% when they left Egypt. And I mentioned, many times that the tikkun can be done either in mitzvahs, which is commandments, tshuva, which is repentance, or yisurin, which is suffering. And those are the three devices, they're called tikkun devices, that enable the tikkun to be done, without going into how and so on. In any case, so when they had left Egypt, they had done the tikkun almost. What was left, of course, is to go to Har Sinai and to receive the Torah, and that Torah was the messianic light. That Torah was not as we have today, but it was really the messianic light. Moshe Rabbeinu, of course, should have been Mashiach ben Yosef, and the Jews sinned. So at that point in time, the tikkun was almost complete again, except they failed because of the sin of the golden calf, and therefore everything now reverted. And again, Jews this time had to go through another tikkun process, or another attempt really at doing the entire concept of tikkun. The next attempt is called the four kingdoms that would subjugate the Jews, Alber Malchus. And that of course is much longer, and that's really what the Jews have been involved with until this particular date. The Jews have wandered between different nations, specifically four of them, and they have been, of course, subjugated, in many ways persecuted by these nations. The first one, of course, was Babylon. The second was Persia, today's Iran. The third one was Greece, and the fourth, of course, is Rome. And the Jews have been subjected to the dominion of these four, again, trying to go from one nation to the next, observing, conforming to the will of God, and hopefully that would bring the tikkun. We are now, of course, in the last. We are Rome, and I had mentioned, what that is. And Rome, of course, is Rome became Christianity, and Christianity, of course, is Western civilization, and that is Rome today. And Rome, of course, we know came from Edom, and Edom, of course, comes from Esav. So Esav, of course, is the last nation that we have to wander in, and so on. So Western civilization really is the last place that the Jews have to go, in that sense. In any case, now, what is important, therefore, is that the Jews wander through the nations, and of course they do this tikkun process. And if you recall what I said, that the tikkun process, in many ways, is two things, two ideas. One is to diminish and to remove all the holiness that the Satan has because of the sins of the Jews, which I had mentioned many times, and this is what they have to do. And as a result of that, the Satan starves, because even he can only have existence from holiness, which is called the Kedusha. It's called the divine flow of holiness, and every time the Jew sins, he's able to take that. When he prosecutes the Jew, he is able to yonik or nourish from that Kedusha. And the Jews have to take it out by one of these three ways, and ultimately, of course, they have to bring down the rest of the Kedusha, and then the world is transformed. Very important concept, which I had mentioned many times and so on. Therefore, at the end of time, when the Jews will almost have completed their tikkun, it's called the termination stage. That's the end of time. That is the time when the tikkun is almost all complete. The Jews will have done the job, and what has to be yet be done is the world now has to enter into a period of time where there are many historical events that take place, and as a result of that, that's called the termination stage. And what that does, it's the stage whereby the Mashiach can enter. That's a very important stage, because we are really in the termination phase, you see, which I will describe. But fundamentally, the termination stage is a stage when the Jews have done almost all of the tikkun. Number two, now God is now concerned, the main thrust of his actions is to set the world up where the Mashiach can come. And therefore there are certain what's called requirements for that to happen. And all of this happens in the termination phase. You see, so the termination phase has what's called three sub-phases or stages. The first is called Ikvus de Mashiach, the footsteps of the Messiah. And what that means is that when if you're in the snow and somebody's ahead of you, right? If you're very close to that person, then you can actually see his footsteps in the snow, the heel of the Mashiach, Ikvus de Mashiach, and so that's the first substage of the termination phase. And what that means, of course, is that the world is now being set up in a way where the Mashiach can make his entry. The next sub-phase or stage is called the Aschalta de Geula, and that is where the Mashiach makes his entry. That's the beginning of redemption. It certainly means when the Mashiach is born, means the one who's destined to be the Messiah, the Mashiach, is born. And even if he's not Mashiach yet, because that takes also time, just like Moshe Rabbeinu didn't know he was Mashiach, almost Mashiach, for 80 years until God spoke to him. So that's certainly because when he's born or he knows, that's called the Aschalta de Geula, the beginning of redemption, and that is truly a messianic precursor. It's really what it is. And the main person involved in that stage, of course, is Mashiach ben Yosef. And he goes through certain events, mankind goes through certain events, and after him, then the Mashiach ben David appears, who of course is a major messianic figure, and then the world is completely transformed. That will last, as we will see, until the end of time, which is the year 6000. We are now at 5778. That will last until the year 6000. And then the world completely is destroyed. Everybody is removed from the world is destroyed, and then the world is transformed into a different type of existence. And that itself takes time for the transformation, and ultimately, as we will see, the world will turn into Olam Haba, which is the future world, and that's eternal. That's the game plan. You see? So what we have is what's called a time reference of what happens and how long it will take, and what the whole purpose of creation really is. One of the ways of really trying to understand it, in many ways, you could take a look at this, is called the creation clock, which I had once mentioned. It's very important. We know that the world will last only 6,000 years. That's it. That's the time that God has allotted the people, all mankind, and certainly the Jews, to do the tikkun, rectification process. 6,000 years. We know that. How do we know? Because the world was created in 6 days. Each day is equivalent to 1,000 years, and therefore, just like the world was created in 6 days, and the 7th day is Shabbos, day of rest, where God ceased his activities in that sense. Therefore, mankind's ability to do tikkun will take place for 6,000 years. That means from the beginning to now, the world has to end in 2240. The year 6000 in the Jewish calendar is the year 2240 in the English calendar, and that's not far from now. What is that? 222 years. Not much, considering that. That means 96% of the world's time has passed, and there's only another 4% left. So clearly, just by that logic, you can begin to see that we have to be very close. Does it make sense that all the prophecies that were stated by the prophets in the Nevi'im, right, is only good for 5 years? That doesn't make sense. So much of the Nevi'im, the prophets, right, when they wrote, goes away on explaining the Messianic era. It's hard to believe that entire era is only be 5 years, and not only that, but it says also in the Navi that the old men and old women will yet live, and these people are going to be 150 years old, 200 years old, and so on. So clearly, we're looking at a time which is obviously has to be very close in order for that to happen, and that's really what it is, and so on. So when you think about that, 6,000 years is 6 days. We can begin to look at that calendar and begin to see very, very important times on that calendar. The real time to begin looking at it is really the English year 1240, because 1240 is the year 5000. The Hebrew calendar year 5000 is 1240, a long time ago. But what's interesting about that, on the creation calendar, it's a Thursday night, 6 p.m. You see, and Thursday night at 6 p.m. begins Friday, and Friday is Erev Shabbos, and on Erev Shabbos we begin to think about and make preparations for Shabbos. So therefore, if you think about that, 1240 has to be a pivotal year. That's the year 5000. That's the beginning of Erev Shabbos, equivalent to Thursday night. That has to be a pivotal year. And of course it was, as I had mentioned, that was the year that in 1240, that was the year that approximately around then, the Zohar was discovered, and the Zohar, Kabbalah, is really the messianic light on a superficial level. And that's really when it was discovered. But what's also happened, which is very interesting, is that that's really the beginning of real science. Roger Bacon lived in that year, and he's considered one of the founders of science because he discarded Aristotle and he went into the way of what's called experimenting. You see, what you see from that is very interesting, because science is really the study of the internal structure of all events. If you're in biology, it's DNA. If you're in physics, it's the atom, and so on. And what the Messianic light really is the ability to see the internal structure or the internal principles of phenomena. So what's interesting is that science itself can only begin if the Messianic light begins. And the Zohar says that at that time, 1240, the Or Mashiach begins to descend. You see, so the manifestation of that descent is the beginning, the real beginning of Kabbalah. There's the finding of the Zohar, and also the concept of science. So it's interesting that science itself is really a reflection of the Messianic light, except it deals with the area called physical world, whereas Kabbalah deals with the idea of the spiritual world. But both of them offer a glimpse, a look into the underpinnings, the internal structure of all things. So therefore you see that science cannot begin until the Messianic light descends, which of course the Zohar says. And that of course happened approximately year 1240, which is the era of the year 5000, which is Thursday night. You see, so therefore that is the first very important or very pivotal time. You see. Then the next pivotal time on that calendar, you see, and you begin to see that these events are not haphazard. They match up specifically to the creation calendar, you see. So the next time the Zohar says that the year in the 5,000, it says by Noach, in the 600th year of the life of Noach, there will be a tremendous, it says that Niftuchu Mayim, the waters from heaven came out, and Tahoimos, and the waters from the depths came out also. So the Zohar said that really means that that alludes to that in the 600th year of the 5th millennium, which is 5,600, the world will experience a burst of that messianic light again. And if you think about that, 1840, that's 1840, 5,600, right? And 1840 was the beginning of the entire Industrial Revolution. You had major science at that point. You had Michael Faraday, and you had many different discoveries that happened at that point. But that is a spurt of the messianic light, you see, in 1840. And in fact, one of them says, the Koshin Samagit says that if the Jews are worthy, then they will get that spurt in the form of tremendous spiritual advancement. If they are not worthy, then the world will get it. And he says that's what happened. The Jews were not worthy, so therefore that spiritual light, which is the messianic light, came down in the form of science, as opposed to the Or Mashiach, as opposed to tremendous advancement in spirituality, whether it be Kabbalah or just tremendous understanding of Torah and so on, So 1840 is the year 5,600, which, if you think about it, is approximately nets, sunrise of Friday morning. Sunrise of Friday morning is light, right? It's the sun. So we see that this is another very, very pivotal time that has happened and so on. But this is all about the advancement of civilization and certainly the messianic light, you see. In any case, also around that time, historically, you find that the concept of nationalism took place, where all of a sudden different countries united within themselves, like Germany and so on, in 1870 or 1871, Bismarck united all the principalities of Germany. You had also Italy uniting. You had a lot of nations began to come together as a nation, as opposed to tribes or little principalities and so on. And that, of course, is very important, because in the end of time, you see, all the nations will go against the Jewish people, which is actually what's happening today. But certainly the preparation of that happens in those years, which of course is dawn, is sunrise of the in the creation calendar. You see, what ultimately, when I say that the tikkun process is very much complete, what it really means is that the Satan is dying, because he gets his energy from that divine flow, you see. So that's really what happens in the end of time, is that the fact that the Satan himself is losing all that incredible divine energy, and therefore he is dying. That's part of the tikkun process, but that's really what happens in the end, you see. And that creates a lot of, obviously, difficulties and so on. One of the things that was necessary, unfortunately, is God does not wait. God does not want to bring the Mashiach 10 years before the end. He's not going to do that. What he wants to do is bring the Mashiach far before that. But part of the problem is that whatever measure, when we don't know what that measure is, the Jews have a tremendous amount of debt in terms of sins that they have, although we ourselves don't understand or know what that means. But the Jews are in a tremendous debt There's a lot of sins that they've done over the thousands of years. So what God does is he has to balance the books, or pay off the debts, which is justice and so on. We find that by Mitzrayim, Egypt, where the Jews were not worthy of the redemption. So what the Baruch Shem did is he accelerated the process. How? Because when Moshe Rabbeinu came, Paro said, you guys are lazy, therefore you need to gather the straw. Not only you have to make the bricks, but you need to gather the straw to make the bricks. So what they had to do, what the Jews did, is they never slept. They had to go around at night looking for straw. In the daytime, they had to make the bricks, and they could the amount of bricks could not diminish. That caused an enormous amount of suffering for the Jews. It must have been horrendous. You see, the question is, why did God do that? Because what we see from Egypt is the acceleration of the process. What God did is remember I said that suffering is one of the tikkun devices. So what God did is he accelerated the process of redemption by bringing on a tremendous amount of suffering to the Jews in the last year of Egypt. You see, this happens also now, and that in many ways is the one of the main meanings of the Holocaust. Nobody really can understand what the Holocaust was about. Nobody knows the mind of God, so to speak. But when you think about it in terms of redemption and what happened in Egypt, the Holocaust, the Shoah, fundamentally is what? The Holocaust is really an acceleration process in order to hurry up the redemption. That's really what it is, you see. So what God did is that in 6 years, from 1939 to 1945, in 6 years, he brought about suffering which we cannot even imagine. Why? See, the purpose of basically is to accelerate the process of tikkun, and therefore the Mashiach can now come much quicker as a result. Because under normal circumstances, probably what that would have meant is that it will take another 500 years for the Jews to be able to have a kapara, have an atonement. But God doesn't want to wait 500 years. So what he did is he bunched up a tremendous amount of yisurin, suffering, in 6 years. And what that did is it cleared up an enormous amount of justice or judgment against the Jews, you see. And as a result of that, the world now really enters in many ways the approach to what's called Aschalta de Gula, the beginning of redemption. That's really the main idea of the Holocaust. It's an accelerator, just like Egypt had an accelerator, so the Jews can be redeemed very quickly. The same thing with this, although it's still many, 50, 60 years since the Holocaust, 70 years, whatever. But relatively speaking, it enormously speeded up or accelerated the process, you see. And it did other things also, but that in many ways is the meaning of the Holocaust, and so on. In any case, so therefore, this begins, of course, in 1945. The Holocaust, of course, is over, and now the world becomes incredibly technologically advanced. And there are many things that, remember, what I'm doing is I'm picking pawns, and how you could see that in many ways they all come together to advance the process, you see. What is happening now is that the messianic light is coming down in incredible amounts. And since we're not really getting it, but the world is getting it in the form of science, therefore what we begin to see is an incredible amount of scientific advancement. More things have been done in the world of science than in the thousands of years before. It's just astounding. You walk into one store, electronics store, then you go back next year and it's like the half the store's advanced. You don't even know what's doing there. That's how fast it's happening. There are 7,000 journal articles published daily for the advancement of Chokhmah. That's the enormous advancement of what's happening out there. Imagine 7,000 journal articles daily. At that level, the knowledge of the world will double every 5.5 years. And this is really all the messianic light coming down to the world, but not to the Jews really, you see. But it's really the messianic light in the form of science, because that's really what the science really is, and so on and so forth. So you can imagine if this amount of chokhmah, knowledge, wisdom, is coming down, then we have to be incredibly close to the end, you see. So therefore, we have this tremendous proliferation of chokhmah, of course, of the goyim and so on, you know. And this continues. Another pivotal point, of course, is Chatzos. Chatzos is noon. You see, we saw 1840, which is basically sunrise, right? And look what happened at that time, right? Noon, which is 1989. September 1989 is another very important point, because what it is, it's Friday on the creation calendar, clock. It's Friday, right? But noon. And we know that on Friday at noon, the sun is at the meridian, and the sun begins to set, never to rise again, because it's Friday, it's the last day. So in September of 1989, one could have predicted that there's going to be an enormous amount of events that will take place. And as a result of that, the world will change. We know what happened, of course. In October, November of 1989, right, the Berlin Wall collapsed, right, and that begins the reunification of Germany. Also what happened shortly thereafter, of course, is communism ended, you see. Gorbachev was the last really, whatever they call the prime minister or secretary, whatever, he was the last one, and in 1991, the whole communism collapsed, you see. So clearly, there's a great deal happening. Besides that, also, that's when the Arabs really began the Intifada, the first Intifada, which would allow them to express themselves and to really begin to revolt, which is the ultimate clash that they will have with the Jewish people. That's Yishmael, and so on. And that's when they broke out of their inability to really, in some way, to become a strong force. That's what happened also at that year. Then there was another idea. You see, the problem then is that even though a tremendous amount of judgment was accomplished earlier, you see, but still, there's still a lot of things to be paid. There's a lot of sinning, unfortunately, that the Jewish people did. So what happened was, I find to be very interesting. You have what's called the Persian Gulf War. Persian Gulf War is an interesting war, you see, because ultimately speaking, nobody died except I think one person in Bnei Brak, and it was really a war that was aimed at Israel and also America in a certain sense, because everybody was worrying about their relatives in Israel and so on, you know. But how do we understand that kind of a war? And the way you can look at it is that what was decreed, and remember, this is all part of the Sultan prosecuting the Jews because he's dying, so he's looking for anything. And essentially what he's saying there is that, hey, you know, you want to bring the Mashiach and all that, you know, the Jews they're sinning in terrible ways and so on, you know. So they don't deserve this. So again, you have to have what's called an accelerating process, where God has to meet justice or judgment. You see, so in many ways, the ketrugim, the prosecutions against the Jewish people, was that they, in many ways, are guilty of their tremendous desecration of Shabbos and so on, and therefore they are perhaps subject to the death penalty, because there's a lot of tremendous amount of Chil Shabbos going on. So what's interesting is that if somebody is subject to a death penalty, there are 4 things you can do, not kill them, but there are one of 4 things that you could do that when they go through that, it's as if they died. That's what the Chazal say, that there are 4 what's called equivalencies of the death penalty. One is extreme poverty. Another one is a person who is blind. A third one, somebody who has tsuras. It's not leprosy, but it's for somebody who has to go outside the community. And a 4th penalty, unfortunately, is if somebody who's childless, cannot have kids and so on, But there's one more. It's called pachad moves, fear of death. Somebody who's afraid that he's going to die, that itself is what's called a death penalty equivalency. So what God did, very interestingly enough, is He subjected the state of Israel to fear of death. He had the Gulf War. He had them firing missiles at Israel, and they couldn't respond because America said, "Don't respond." So Israel had to just sit there like a sitting duck. And there was if you recall 1990, what was happening with Saddam Hussein, the whole Israel was frightened. I mean, they could have taken him out, but America said, no, you can't do that because we don't want Saudi Arabia to get mad. The whole thing is insane when you think about that. But ultimately what it meant is that this fear of death that Israel was under, and also tremendous amount of fear in America or in other places of the world, because many people have relatives in Israel and so on, that was a kapara. You see. So therefore, what that war did is, what was interesting about that war, is nobody really died as a result of a missile, which is amazing when you think about that, But what did happen is that there was a tremendous amount of fear of death, and that was an acceleration of whatever the Jewish people is guilty of. You see, so that also happened just around 1990, which is of course Chatzos, midday. So that's what also happened. It's again an acceleration process to bring about the end. 39 missiles. That's how many. Because there are 39 malachas, activities that you can't do on Shabbos. You see. In any case, there's a lot of ideas that are very fascinating. You can connect with this and so on, But that's also what's called an acceleration process, you see. And then, of course, communism collapses again, and that's also a further movement toward that. And then, of course, after that, you had Clinton. He became president. And the meaning of Clinton as president is really very interesting, because the fact that he became president itself is a miracle, because he's basically nobody from Arkansas. Like, whoever heard of him before, And this guy comes out of nowhere to beat Bush as president and so on. But the meaning of that, which I always find very interesting, is that God chose Clinton to be the president. Even though whoever heard of this guy before, governor of Arkansas, like, well, what does that mean, and so on. Because what the purpose of Clinton really in the end is to legitimatize the Arabs, which is what he did. Arafat came to the White House more times than any other statesman. His purpose was to because the Arabs would not make any move, because so what Clinton did is he gave them tremendous amount of respect and to Arafat, and therefore the esteem of the Arabs rose, because ultimately speaking, they will, and as a result of that, the fact that America gave this such esteem, that would mean that they would, if once they achieve this kind of esteem, that would mean that they can now think that they can fight Israel, and that would allow them an idea, give them an idea that they can be victorious. You see, so that's really what his purpose was, is the concept of Clinton legitimatizing the Arab people, which he did. He's the main reason why the Arabs have had such success, especially with Arafat, in terms of the esteem that the world holds them in. Then, of course, you had the Oslo Accords, which again legitimatized the Arabs and so on, which is a terrible mistake that Israel did, of course, because essentially what they said is that you have a right in the land of Israel. Suicide to even state that. Till then, Jews said, hey, you have no right to Israel. But with the Oslo Accords, they legitimatized the Arab claim, which automatically diminished the entire ability of Israel to hold on to Israel in the court of world opinion. That's really what happened. But in any case, so that happened. All of this is to allow the Arabs to assume a certain respect and status among the nations of the world, so they can diminish their fear, of course, of Israel. And that's why many things happened after that. The war in, I think, in 2006, where Israel actually not lost the war, but the Arabs succeeded in doing terrible things. It all gives them the delusion that they can now take on Israel, and that's the setup for the final war between Yishmael and the Jews, and so on, you know. As a result of that, you now see also many other things that are taking place. And I had mentioned this previously, but ultimately what has to happen now is the beginning of the redemption itself, and that is where Trump now, of course, now begins to side with Israel. This is the tshuva of Esav. That's the next part of the redemption process, you see. And of course, the emergence of Iran is very important, because that's a fundamental nation that will war with Israel, and also, of course, try to war with America, is the whole emergence of Iran. That itself is interesting, because how in the world did Iran get so far? And what the Persian did, which is in the Persian Gulf War, is he allowed America to be distracted by thinking that the real enemy is Saddam Hussein, Iraq. And that's what they did. So they really fought with, they allowed Iraq, Saddam Hussein, their focus was on taking him out, because they saw it as he was the major enemy, not Iran. Meanwhile, while they're dealing with Iraq and Saddam Hussein, Iran was doing their nuclear stuff, you see. So really what happened is the Iraq war, besides being a pachad moves for the Jews, it will also provide a tremendous distraction to America, to allow them to believe that the real enemy is not Iran, it's Iraq, which of course is not true. The real enemy of the Jews is not Iraq, it's Iran. And that's another purpose of the war, the Persian Gulf War, is to make America think that the real problem is not Iran, it is Iraq. Of course, now everybody realizes the mistake that Bush made, or that Clinton made at that time. But this again allowed Iran to build, and now Iran is set to do whatever it has to do, which I had mentioned last week in terms of the Yalkut, the Medrash, and so on, you know. But you notice all of these things happen slowly, but in the end, it's one purpose, is to allow the advancement of a messianic process, and that's what we see. Of course, now we see what? We see, of course, 9/11 happened, right? 2001, 9/11. What was that point? That point is to warn America, the whole world, of the radical Islam, of the danger of Islam, and that's what warned America, exactly how dangerous all of this could be. Because if you think about it, Osama bin Laden should never have bombed the World Trade Center. He wasn't anywhere near capable of taking on America, so why did he do it? Because what happens is that the Persian forced him to do it, so that America should be warned and properly prepared to ultimately enter into a war with certainly Iran. So even 9/11, the purpose is really to wake up America as to really what is happening, and so on. But what we see now is very interesting, because now, we just saw now that the whole UN went against Israel, and they tried to force Trump, of course, to rescind his declaration. But this is, like I mentioned last week, this is a classic Gog and Magog. 70 nations, of course, and I told you that the gematria of Gog and Magog is 70, and the UN really represents all 70 nations. They will, of course, this is the classic prophecy of Yechezkel, you see, because the UN really is the entire world. The UN really is the entire world, and we now have a fulfillment of that prophecy, you see. Again, all of this is to move the entire redemption process forward. So we have that, you see. But now the next pivotal moment, of course, is what's called 12:30, Sheish v'chetzi. Why? Because when the sun is at the highest point, the meridian, right, you don't see any shadow. The sun is directly above. And that is exactly a very important point. Because, but at 12:30, it's called Sheish v'chetzi, then the sun begins to lean toward the west, and then it produces a shadow. And that's when you can daven mincha, you see. And that's when halachically becomes what's called Beinu Arbayim. It becomes Beinu Arbayim, which is afternoon, you see. And it says in the Novi, Le'es Erev Yihye Or. At the time of afternoon, Erev means evening or afternoon, whatever, Yihye Or, that's when there will be light. And we are now, on that creation calendar, we are now 12:39, past 12:30, you see. And that is why you're seeing so many incredible advancements of the messianic process. That's really what's happening. We're 12:39. We're past the 12:30 mark, you see. And as a result of that, today, it's like almost every day something is happening. So this whole concept of Trump now addressing Israel and advancing there is all messianic, basically. That's how close we are. Edom, like I said, Edom, which of course is the America, and I mentioned that it's the Toiv Sheba Esav, the good part of Esav. They need to do tshuva, and that's exactly what happened. And that's why Trump, of course, is the president, because he's the one that is bringing America around to do tremendous, to allow Israel to become what it could become. And he's doing that, and it's going to get much better, because he's going to allow Israel to do many things. And so this is a very important idea. Also, in the end of time, Yishmael has to falter and fail. And that started in February in 2011 with in Tunisia and so on, And basically, when you look around the Arab world, most of them are failed states. So this is another very important messianic condition, is that Yishmael, which has subjugated the Jews for so long, is now failing. And not only that, but Yishmael also, like I mentioned, is also doing tshuva. Is also repenting, and you see that slowly with Saudi Arabia coming around to support Israel. And they'll probably do that openly, and so on. Which is very good, because ultimately that means that Abbas will become irrelevant. Actually, he is irrelevant. Because when Trump came out and said that Israel and Jerusalem is Israel, and so on, what that essentially does is negate the whole Arab claim that Israel is occupied territory. And the whole concept of occupied territory is absurd, because Arabs never had a state in Israel that we should occupy, you see. If anybody ever analyzed all of this, all of these claims based on reality, international law and reality, the whole thing would fall just like a house built on sand. But nobody cares, you see. And that's because the world is still fundamentally still anti-Semitic. Therefore, they don't look at reality. And in the end, God is going to have a field day with these guys, because he's going to say, I don't understand something. Actually, I do understand something. You say that you adhere to the law, right? And that you look for evidence, so on. How could you say that Israel is occupied territory when there was no such thing as an Arab state? What are you talking about, occupied? And the nations of the world, they have no concept of what the judgment will be when that judgment day comes against them. Because what they say is so thinly absurd. What they say is so easy to disprove that I mean, you can always feel sorry for them, what's going to happen when that comes, you see. But most of it basically is the concept of what? Of anti-Semitism. That's what it is. It's all it is. I mean, whoever heard that a nation, that the United Nations deny a nation the ability to have a capital, which is the true capital. Everybody knows Jerusalem belongs to Israel. Everybody knows that even in the New Testament you have Jerusalem, where what's his name overturned the money changers. The Christian Bible talks about Jerusalem being Jewish and the temple. So how do they deny even that? And the UN says that Israel has no. It used to be in the past where the UN used to deny different parts of Israel. Jerusalem is not Israel, the Golan is not Israel, or whatever, Now they just say, hey, the whole land is occupied. They've hit a new low. This is unheard of. They know Israel belongs to the Jews. Everybody knows that. Besides the Torah itself, Christianity itself says that. So what has happened is the UN has reached a new low, where they just deny all of Israel. Hebron is not Israel, right? It's all occupied. Jerusalem is occupied, and everything is illegal, and so on and so forth. It's just beyond belief. Well, it's just beyond belief how they can take a position which is so absurd. You see. So therefore, Edom is doing tshuva, which is of course the Tov Sheba-Esav, the good part of Esav, which is America. Yishmael is collapsing, but Yishmael itself, the part that hasn't collapsed, itself is doing tshuva, or about to do tshuva. Arafat is becoming, not Arafat, he's irrelevant because he's dead, but Abbas is becoming irrelevant, which we see happening now. And ultimately speaking, which I had mentioned last week, is that the next phase is what's called the transition phase, with the Erev Rav, those Jews that refuse to allow spirituality to dominate and so on, where they say, of course, that the Jews are the Jewish people because of the culture, that's why we're Jewish. We have the land of Israel, the culture, but they of course will never say that the whole concept of being Jewish really is God has chosen us to represent Him and to bring Him close to mankind. They will never say that. So they have to go also. And that's how that's going to happen is in many ways very interesting. But I believe there will be an individual the Erev Rav will collapse, and there will be an individual, and he's called a transition figure, because after him comes Mashiach, and he will slowly convert the Jewish people and certainly bring them closer to God. And that's a transition figure before the Mashiach comes and so on, and once that happens, then I think the Jewish people will be in shock, because right now it looks like these guys can never leave. This whole concept of Erev Rav, these people who deny the authenticity and the uniqueness of the Torah as that which makes Jews unique. Their overthrow will be incredible, and everybody's going to be stunned and watch that happen. And same thing with the entrance of a transitional figure who will then begin to change Israel. And I mentioned last week, it's not hard. All you have to do is reintroduce the Torah to high school kids in Israel, you see? And all you have to do is fund the Kiruv organizations. They can do it, because they're very successful and so on, without compelling anybody to be religious. And I believe that's coming up next, because we already have America, we have the Arabs and so on, but the next thing is really the fall of the Erev Rav. And when that happens, then, get your plane tickets. Because I believe the Mashiach is then right around the corner. And then, of course, you'll have the era of Mashiach. You'll have the rebuilding of the Beis Hamikdash. Then the whole world will recognize Israel, you see. And that's really happening now. With America recognizing Israel, that it's their land and their capital, then the status or the stature of Israel rises in the nations of the world. And that's really, in many ways, very important. Because when Jews do become spiritual, since the Israel has risen in stature among the world, then that Judaism itself will rise in stature. It's all about it's all about taking the Jewish people from the dumps, from the degradation that they have suffered for thousands of years, and to restore the greatness of the Jewish people. That's really what we're watching. So Israel is doing that in a certain sense in terms of many areas. There's the agriculture and water conservation and science and medicine and cybersecurity and so on. They are rising. But now that America has recognized Israel, of course, and the fact that that will raise the stature of the Jews to the entire world. So when the Jews do become spiritual, when that nation again turns toward God, then the world will recognize that, because the Jews will have had that tremendous stature and so on, And this is all happening in our time, you see. And remember I said, it's happening and it's accelerating, because it's now after 12:30. It's 12:39. And like I said, it says in the Navi, right? Le'es erev yihyeh or, at the time of evening, which is after 12:30, yihyeh or, there will be light. And this is what's happening now. So what do we see? We see an entire panorama of the times of when Mashiach comes. We see the entire panorama of how the whole 6,000 years has been nothing more than an attempt to do the tikkun, which is to bring God back, to serve God, and to allow the nations also to realize that. The only thing is that there have been different actors on the play. In the beginning was Adam, Harishon, the first man. Then you had mankind. Then you had Avram Avinu. You have Moshe Rabbeinu in Egypt. And then we have to go through the 4 nations that will subjugate us to do the same concept of tikkun. The termination phase begins with, as I mentioned, the footsteps of the Messiah, which really begins in 1840. You see. And then when you hit 1990, you have what's called Chatzos, midday, and we are about to encounter the Aschalta de Gula. We are about to enter that period of time called the beginning of redemption. And that's really what we're watching. And that's why almost every day there's something incredible going on. It's like the news never stops. Somebody just told me that there's a lot of demonstrations going on in Iran. That's also incredible. Iran, and I think Iran is afraid to do something, because they knew they can get away with killing these people in the time of Obama, because Obama, forget about Obama. He was, I've never seen such a wimp, and so on, But they know that Trump is looking, and he's probably taking names, as he said, So they're probably worried, because if they come out looking too barbaric and killing these people, something's going to happen, and they're worried, and so on. So this is another development. But every day there's another development happening. But in the end, this is the direction it has to go. Tikkun has to be complete. God's will must happen. There's no way to get around it. And this is the staging. I believe we're about to enter the Aschalta de Geula, the beginning of redemption, and we are now seeing it, and so on, And the real key concept next is the fall of the Erev Rav. And we know the Erev Rav basically is, in America, it's the Reform, the conservative movement, Reconstructionists. In Israel, it's fundamentally, unfortunately, the government of Israel, the Supreme Court, the media, These are all Erev Rav, and they, in many ways, they are destroying, they're not destroying Israel, they're not destroying Jews, they are destroying Judaism. You see, and that's the whole problem, because the essential concept of a Jew is Judaism, is his religion, and they, of course, are completely, in many ways, either against it, and certainly, if they can, if the opportunity presents itself, they will, of course, go against the Torah. The guys like Lapid and so on and so forth. And these people are horrendous and so on. And the problem is that, Israel does not see itself as a spiritual nation. Israel sees itself that it has to adapt, become a copy of the world. That's why Israel prides itself on museums, culture, art, all this kind of stuff, artist colonies, whatever, That's what makes them proud, because that's what they see. Israel has an incredible inferiority complex, where it's always trying to run after the nations of the world. That's really what it's trying to do, and that's why the more culture that they get into, they feel good about themselves. But Israel people don't realize that the greatest contribution that they can give the world, of course, is spirituality, and that's really in the end what they have to do. And slowly it's turning that way, So we have to hope that it's going to happen very shortly, which I think it will, and so on, because like I say, we're after 1230, we're now headed into that era of where God wants the spirituality to be the dominant force of the Jewish people. And we are seeing this happening every day. In any case, so this is sort of like the panorama of world history, and how everything fits in that way. And even if we don't know the pieces of the chess game, we don't know how each thing necessarily fits into that scheme, and how the next thing, and how they're all connected, but we can see checkmate. That we can see it. Checkmate is the death of the Sultan. That's checkmate, you see. And the Jews will have brought that about, and once the Sultan dies, then that's the end of evil, that's the end of disease, it's the end of every negative thing you can imagine. That's it.
And peace.
And, peace, when you think about that, peace is really the result of an understanding of reality. That's really what it is. The disease that mankind suffers from is really ignorance, because they don't really know the real reality. The real reality is God, the Torah, the Jewish people, that the whole world ultimately has to, bring in a redemption. It's a redemption process. And therefore, most people think that there's somebody, that they can dominate the world, they can do whatever they want. They're into money and power, and honor and all this kind of stuff, That's ignorance, you see. Once man realizes the true reality, which is spirituality, then automatically there's peace, because he knows his place. So that's really what we suffer from. Ignorance of reality. And the whole concept of redemption in the end is to make mankind aware of reality, which is ruchnius, spirituality, God, and so on. That's the whole point of it. And once mankind realizes reality, then everything changes. Everything. There's peace, there's prosperity, there's blessing, everything, and so on. And that's really what we're headed into. But it's like I say, right now we're in the middle of this, Chevle Mashiach, and it really gets rough and so on, But in the end, we could see what the end is, even if we don't understand the individual pieces, the individual moves, and the connection between all the moves. But at least we know what the end is. The end is the redemption, not only of the Jews, it's the redemption of all mankind, when they realize the terrible mistakes that they've made, and then there can be peace. That's ultimately what there will be. Peace and prosperity and security, and the nations realizing that everything that has happened in the 6,000 years, whatever, has been for only one purpose, and that is to bring God back. That's it. It's a panorama. Any questions? Yeah.
When Akash Baruch Hu takes care of Hatayim,
When he takes what?
takes care of Hatayim throughout history,
Yes.
but that doesn't mean Hatayim stops.
Yeah.
But, unless the person, even Enish, paraphrasing, but so being that the books have to be balanced perfectly by Olam Haba, so to speak. So does that mean that eventually it's going to have to be a tshuva movement or something where at the time of Mashiach people are going to have to be perfect, or is there going to just be sort of like an equilibrium, or?
Well, you see, that's why there's a Mashiach ben Yosef and before Mashiach ben David. There are different reasons, but one of the things is that Mashiach ben Yosef is the one who will allow everybody to become spiritual, so they can all atone, and then Mashiach ben David can come.
A tshuva movement.
Yeah. There's going to be a massive tshuva movement, yes. And it's going to boggle the mind how it happened. Nobody's going to believe it when he does, you see. So Mashiach ben Yosef is really, I would use a funny expression, Mashiach ben Yosef is a halfway house, funny expression, But it's a halfway house in the sense that, well, there has to be a time when everybody's waking up, and then everybody's doing tshuva, you see. And as time goes on, then they will have concluded their tshuva, kapara, and then in comes Mashiach ben David, you see. So that's really what Mashiach ben Yosef does. He's the one who transforms the world from, a lack of spirituality to a total spirituality. And that's when Mashiach ben David enters, you see. So that's really what it's all about, so,
In some ways today, people, I think, realize something's going on.
I think everybody realizes something going on.
And it's easier to, in a certain respect, to believe the promises God made to bring us back to Israel. We could see it.
Yeah.
When you think about Jews in the Middle Ages and David and Shimon Esrei, the faith, there was no light at the end of the tunnel.
No.
The faith those people had was mind-boggling.
Well, that was their
They were
test.
in hopeless situations.
Yeah. Now, in the Middle Ages, it was terrible for the Jews. But that was their
And they
nisayon.
kept the faith. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. The merit that they accumulated because of that, we don't even have, we have no comprehension. But that was meant to be. God puts Jews in different situations, and in those situations he has to act in the way that is appropriate. It's halachic, it's appropriate, and so on. Yeah, sure. That's the faith that they had is really incredible. They just gave their lives for Torah. How many people did that, and so on, Anything else? Fine. Next week, Mashiach.
Last week?
What's that?
So last week?
Yeah, next week I'll be giving a shiur. It's the last week, and then I'm off to Eretz Yisrael for a while, for 8 weeks, and then I'm back right after Purim, and we'll just continue. Who knows what after Purim is going to be? Because remember, we are headed for very important months. You see, Teves, we're in Teves now, right? And then we have Adar, Shvat, and I think there's a Zohar. Is it a Zohar that says Rosh Chodesh Shvat is a messianic day? It's a Yom Geula. It's interesting. Then you have Adar Shvat. Tu B'Shvat is very important because that's the reversal of good, of evil to good. That's when the flowers the fruit begins to blossom. That means something's going to happen. Certainly in Shvat, and then Adar is the month of Ben Yosef. Adar is the month of Yosef. Then Nisan is the redemption.
I got to pack my luggage.
Yeah, who knows? But there's no question that we are in a very transformative period. There's no question about that. Just the last week, 2 weeks has been incredible. What's been happening, Yeah, it's certainly happening. In many ways, it's a tremendous merit to be alive today. Because we're seeing. On the other hand, it's very difficult because we've witnessed so much terrible antagonism, toward the Jewish people, and so on. But but it is an incredible thing to watch.
They fired
Anyway.
Gaza 4 missiles at a memorial service given for the Israeli soldier that was captured in Gaza. They aimed it at that memorial service.
Okay. These
3
are
of them were shot down by the Iron Dome, and 1 of them landed.
okay. These are just
It just keeps happening every day.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But that's not the key. The key isn't the individual events. The key is to watch the scenario of Esav doing tshuva, Yishmael doing tshuva, the Arabs collapsing in that sense, and the Erev falling. That's the key to watch. Don't focus on an individual missiles or whatever. That's distractions. The key is watch what's called the large requirements, the large movements that have to happen. Don't get distracted. It's like a basketball game. What's the incredible thing about a basketball game or a football game? Everybody, right? There's only one thing that anybody wants to know in the game. And what's that? Where's the ball? That's it. Everything else is irrelevant. You know what I'm saying? It's amazing when you think about that. Where's the ball? You see? And in football, right? Where's the ball? Because the ultimate thing they have to know to be able to get it over the goal. And we know what goal. And wait, and we know what the goal really is. It's not goal. It's the goal, right? It's the Redeemer. That's what they have to keep the eye on, right? And so on, Okay. Soon.